Hello everyone, it's Miss LaChance and I hope you've enjoyed the first week of summer. I know I have, but I missed you all already. And this summer I'm going to be doing a read aloud series where I read the book Flora and Ulysses. I would have read this book in the last few weeks of school, but we ran out of time. So I'm excited to be on this channel this summer to read this book to you guys. Today I'm going to be reading the back blurb as well as chapters 1 through 7. I'm going to be reading 7 chapters in each video that I make. So these might be longer videos, but feel free to watch them at your own pace. So without any further ado, I'm going to be reading the back blurb of Flora and Ulysses. This is actually a shorter back blurb, and it says, "She is a natural-born cynic. He is an unassuming squirrel," talking about Flora and Ulysses. "Together, Flora and Ulysses will conquer villains, defend the defenseless, and protect the weak," or something. So it describes Flora as a natural-born cynic. I want you to comment in the comments below if you know what the word cynic means. If not, if you have a dictionary at home, or you can even use Google to Google that word cynic. You can go ahead and pause this video to do that now. And if you've looked up that word cynic in the dictionary or Googled it already, that word cynic is actually describing somebody who has a lack of empathy, somebody who views the world in a very negative light. But I'm here to tell you now that as the book develops and as we get a better understanding of Flora and as she goes through a couple of challenges, she actually starts to change. So I'm excited to read this book to you guys and for you to see the character development in Flora in the book Flora and Ulysses. All right, I'm going to stop talking now and we'll get into the book. The first few pages are actually kind of like a graphic novel. It has a comic strip and some words to describe what is happening in the Tickham kitchen. So it says, "In the Tickham kitchen, late on a summer afternoon." And that man is saying, "Ahem." "Happy birthday to you." "What is this, Donald?" "This is your birthday present. It is a Ulysses Super Suction Multi-Terrain 2000X. Happy birthday." "It's a vacuum cleaner?" "It's a Ulysses 2000X. Yup, it's the crown jewel of vacuums. It features an extra long cord so that absolutely no mess, no dirt is ever out of your reach. It's indoor/outdoor. It goes everywhere. It does everything." "Goody." "You have to try it out. Turn it on. For heaven's sake, Donald. Please." So this is Mr. and Mrs. Tickham on Mrs. Tickham's birthday, and Mr. Tickham gets Mrs. Tickham a vacuum cleaner, but apparently it's a very special vacuum cleaner in his eyes. All right, so when they turn the vacuum cleaner on, it starts to get a little wild. Whoa, hey now. What in the world, Donald? It's multi-terrain. You should try it outside. And that's how it all began, with a vacuum cleaner. Really. Chapter 1 is called A Natural-Born Cynic. Flora Bell Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing 2 things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. "Flora!" her mother shouted. "What are you doing up there?" "I'm reading," Flora shouted back. "Remember the contract!" her mother shouted. "Do not forget the contract." At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. "I hate romance," said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. "Yup," thought Flora, "that's me." She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickums' backyard. "What the heck?" said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickum running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. "This can't be," thought Flora. "Who vacuums their yard?" Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickum knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge. And the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. "A few bolts shy of a load," said Flora out loud. And then she saw that Mrs. Tickum and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. "Hey now," said Flora. She banged on the window. "Watch out," she shouted. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." There is just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel"? It didn't make any difference, though, what word she said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. "This malfeasance must be stopped," said Flora in a deep and superheroic voice. "This malfeasance must be stopped," was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing incandesto and became a towering, crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. And then there's a picture of what's happening in the Tickums' front yard here. As you can see, there's a squirrel right in front of the vacuum cleaner. And Flora's looking out the window. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still, she stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Flump! "Holy Bagoomba," said Flora. And that's the end of chapter 1. The first few chapters are pretty short. Chapter 2 is only a page, and chapter 3 is only 2 or 3 paragraphs. So I'll show you the layout of these 2 pages. Chapter 2 is called The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this: "I wonder what there is to eat." This thought is then repeated with the small variations. Example, "Where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food?" And "Are there more pieces of food?" some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All of this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickums' backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going on in his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, "Here, at last, is my fate. Come to meet me." He did not think, "Oh, please, give me one more chance and I will be good." What he thought was, "Man, I sure am hungry." And then there was a terrible roar, and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in his squirrel head, not even thoughts of food. Chapter 3 is called The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly swallowing a squirrel was a bit much, even for the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickums' birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickum bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickum, "what's next?" She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. "Help," she said. "I think I killed a squirrel." Chapter 4 is called A Surprisingly Helpful Cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs, and as she ran, she thought, "For a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person." She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, "Where are you going, Flora Belle?" Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickums in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickum a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell and rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled "Terrible Things Can Happen to You." As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible Things Can Happen to You detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run, locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible Things Can Happen to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. "I'll figure it out," said Flora. "What will you figure out?" said Mrs. Tickum. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel. Fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. "Have you lost your mind?" said Mrs. Tickum. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. Chapter 5 is called The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone blank, black. And then, into this black blankness, there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel, "you bet." He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. The voice was counting. The light receded. "Breathe!" the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. I'm wondering what that word obliges means, or obliged. If the voice is shouting, "Breathe," and then the squirrel takes a breath, and the author says, "The squirrel obliged," what do you think that means? Go ahead and comment in the comments below if you have a guess that you'd like to make. Chapter 6 is called "In the Event of a Seizure." "Well, he's breathing," said Mrs. Tickum. "Yes," said Flora, "he is." She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickum, "look at him." She chuckled quietly. She shook her head. And then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick, or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically, and Florabelle Buckman started looking around at the Tickums' backyard for a stick. Chapter 7 is called "The Soul of a Squirrel." The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly flung wide open. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was very, very hungry. Here's what's going on that page. Sniffing the vacuum cleaner. Who can say what astonishments are hidden inside of the most mundane being? What is the squirrel doing? It looks like he's lifting the vacuum cleaner up on top of his head. That does not seem like a normal squirrel for sure. Do we think maybe being sucked up in the vacuum maybe changed the squirrel a little bit? I'm not too sure, but if you have any predictions as to what might happen next, I want you to go ahead and comment in the comment section below. We have reached the end of chapter 7, so I'm going to stop this video now, but I will be back soon to read chapters 8 through 15. And hopefully we can get more of a description of what is going on with this squirrel. Thank you so much for watching. Again, I miss you all very much, and I hope you're having a nice summer so far. And I will see you in the next video when I read chapters 8 through 15 of the book Flora and Ulysses by Kate DiCamillo. Bye, friends!